Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where marriage isn't a celebration of love. It's a survival strategy involving goats, gossip, and just enough stew to keep you upright. Imagine yourself in a dim cottage, lit only by a cracked lantern and the faint glow of the fireplace. Outside, the wind carries the scent of wet hay. Inside, your neighbors are whispering about the Smiths marrying off their daughter, who just turned 12 this morning. You weren't even invited. You're here because this is just life. It's a time when the word childhood hasn't quite been invented yet. You're either small or useful. 12 means useful. Your family owns a quarter-acre of workable soil, a suspiciously limp pig, and a spinning wheel that squeaks like it's haunted. The only way to keep the farm afloat is to tie yourself to someone with better cows or slightly less debt. You look at your daughter, not quite as tall as the fence post yet, and think, yes, let's get her married. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Just curious, who else is in their pajamas, listening to medieval marriage laws at 11 p.m. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're crouched on a low wooden stool, listening to your cousin complain about dowries. She's already got 5 children, one who won't stop coughing, and another who recently tried to eat a candle. She's helping arrange a marriage for her neighbor's daughter, who has, by miracle or bribery, managed to secure a small inheritance. 2 goats and a tin brooch shaped like a duck. That's more than some bring. Marriage here isn't about love. It's about merging survival plans. You're not creating romance. You're forging an alliance. Like small-time nobility with worse food. A good match means someone who won't drink away the wheat profits or sleep through plowing season. You consider that 12-year-old's future and wince, but only a little. After all, you didn't have time to worry about this when you were 12. Historians still argue whether rural communities truly forced girls to marry that young en masse, or if these stories are outliers, amplified by scandal. But in many legal records, the marriageable age starts at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, as declared by the church. Technically, it's with consent. Realistically, that consent was about as voluntary as giving up the last piece of bread to the taller sibling. In places like 13th century England, the church tried to maintain a balance. Marriage required mutual agreement and physical maturity, a concept they helpfully defined as being able to procreate. Q priests awkwardly inspecting underfed teenagers for signs of puberty like some divine HR department. Meanwhile, noble families scribble names into contracts while the actual children in question are still practicing their handwriting. They may not even meet until the feast. One historian dryly noted that aristocratic weddings were as much about producing heirs as boiling cabbage. You can tell he wasn't invited to many parties. But let's not just pick on Europe. Across the globe, marriage age has always been a moving target, shaped more by economics and mortality rates than anything else. When lifespans hover around 35 years and childbirth is riskier than bear wrestling, you don't wait around for your daughter to find herself. You marry her early so she's not left with nothing, or worse, someone else's nothing. Still, it wasn't all doom and child-sized bridal veils. In some regions, ceremonies could be postponed until the girl reached full growth. In others, early betrothal was more of a promise than a contract, a placeholder until the couple was older. Of course, the line between promise and irreversible life choice was often about as clear as swamp water. And while noble families might have sealed treaties with infant engagements, commoners were often more flexible. The father of the bride might delay the marriage until after the next harvest, or until the boy built his own hut, or until the girl stopped trying to milk chickens. There were degrees of practicality at play. Still, by modern standards, the idea of marrying off a preteen is somewhere between baffling and barbaric. You feel that, even now, while sipping imaginary rhubarb tea and watching the firelight flicker off your imaginary tunic buttons. But back then, it was logical, practical, even loving, in a twisted subsistence level kind of way. If you didn't marry off your daughter young, another family might. Or worse, she might fall in love with the miller's son, who smells like burnt barley and has exactly 0 goats. So here you sit, hearing the story of yet another girl betrothed at 12, and you sigh, because no one really asks the girl what she wants. They ask what she brings, what she'll cost, and how long before her womb can start paying rent. You wrap your shawl tighter, watch the lantern gutters dim, and wonder, would you have done the same if it meant your family ate this winter? You wake with a start, not in your own bed, but in the corner of a thatched roof home. The morning light slipping through the slats like spilled milk. A pot of thin porridge simmers quietly, giving off the faint smell of overcooked oats and resignation. Outside, chickens cluck like they're in on a joke you haven't heard yet. Inside, a 12-year-old girl buttons her best tunic, which still doesn't quite fit at the shoulders. Today is her wedding day. She's mostly worried about tripping. You watch her from your cozy imaginary corner. Her name might be Agnes, or Freydis, or even Mira, depending on which part of the world you're in. What doesn't change is the tension in her hands as she tries to braid her hair without a mirror. Her mother's too busy kneading bread to help, muttering something about the brewer's son being a fine match if you squint. It's not that anyone expects love. It's just that everyone hopes for a lack of disaster. There's no grand wedding dress, no harpist playing Vivaldi under a floral arch. There's a dress that used to belong to her cousin, a garland of weeds braided into her hair, and a big wooden spoon to keep the smaller siblings in line during the ceremony. You offer her a silent nod as she ties her shoes. She sees nothing. Of course, you're not really there. By this age, she's been working since she could walk, hauling water, tending fires, and trying not to get kicked by the family mule. She's no stranger to hard labor, but today she'll take on the role of wife, even if she still sometimes gets caught picking her nose. You think about how you spent your 12th birthday, and it involved cake, not contracts. Historians still debate whether rural families truly preferred early marriages, or if it was the exception, an unfortunate fluke when times were especially harsh. Church records confirm that child marriages were legal but not always encouraged. Still, when crops failed, disease loomed, and you had more mouths than spoons, marrying off a daughter at 12 wasn't scandalous. It was strategy. The consent element was mostly symbolic. Technically, she had to say yes. Realistically, if she didn't say yes, there were consequences. Not harsh ones, necessarily, but there might be less food next week. Or her father might lose face. Or she might be left out of the village's next weaving circle gossip exchange, which is somehow worse. The wedding itself will be modest. Maybe a priest, maybe not. Maybe just a local elder with a mug of cider who declares them wed after 3 rehearsed lines and a shrug. The groom is 15, all elbows and sheepish grins. He fidgets as if his tunic has fleas. You note that he's still shorter than the bride. That'll change soon. There are jokes made, some of them mildly inappropriate. An aunt laughs a little too loud. A younger sibling drops a beat. And through it all, the bride stares at the dirt, her toes curling inside her shoes like she could root into the earth and disappear. After the ceremony, there will be bread, ale, and maybe a fiddle if someone remembered to bring it. A good wedding means no one fights, and the livestock behave. A great wedding means someone passes out face down in turnips, and the new couple gets a blanket without holes in it. There's a curious tenderness to all this. No one is being cruel. No one believes they're doing anything wrong. They're giving her what they believe is a good start. A home, a husband who doesn't smell too bad, and a fighting chance at respectability. You're the only one looking around like something's off. You're also the only one not hungry. After the ceremony, the girl helps stack cups. Her fingers are red from carrying hot soup bowls. The other kids chase each other with sticks, oblivious. The groom tries to catch her eye. She avoids it. They'll sleep in the loft tonight, with a goat below and 3 cousins snoring a few feet away. Privacy is a myth. In some cultures, the consummation is immediate. In others, it's delayed, years sometimes. The marriage is more of a promise than a binding expectation. But in this village, tonight is expected to be a beginning. Neither of them really knows what that means. There's no pamphlet, no talk, just a vague understanding that they're supposed to act different now. You feel the weight of that unspoken expectation pressing down on her like the roof's thatch during a thunderstorm. She will wake up tomorrow with the same chores, but a new title, wife, and that changes everything and nothing at once. One scholar once joked that medieval children grew up sideways, mimicking adult behavior long before understanding it. You see that now in the way this 12-year-old tries to carry herself with dignity while dropping an entire carrot into the fire. She wants to be seen as grown. She just doesn't know what grown looks like yet. You sit with that thought, sipping imaginary cider, the kind that's tart enough to pucker your lips. Around you, the wedding winds down. The fiddler is asleep. Someone is crying quietly, and no one knows if it's from joy or indigestion. The bride disappears into the shadows of her new home, still clutching the duck-shaped brooch. You remain behind, watching the fire shrink, your thoughts as loud as the silence left in the wake of a child turned adult in the span of a single morning. You shuffle your feet on the cold stone floor of a manor house now, blinking at the sudden change in scenery. Gone is the muddy village path. Here, velvet curtains hang heavy over leaded glass windows, and candles burn in ornamental sconces shaped like lions that look a little embarrassed by their assignment. The air smells faintly of wine, beeswax, and quiet ambition. You've arrived at court, where marriage is less about turnips and more about treaties. The young lady of the house sits still as a tapestry. She's 12, maybe 13, and wears a silk gown that seems determined to eat her. It's stitched so tightly around her ribs, you suspect breathing is optional. 2 servants pin heavy gold earrings to her ears, while a third brushes her eyebrows upward, as if that will somehow prepare her to marry a distant cousin who owns more vineyards than teeth. Her mother glides in and begins listing facts. The groom's lands border ours. His uncle has an alliance with the king's steward, and their wine tariffs have been favorable since the last regional skirmish. Not once does anyone ask how the girl feels. She sits politely, nods where expected, and grips the armrest like she's preparing for battle. You admire the strategy. This is what historians call dynastic marriage, and it's as romantic as a tax audit. Noble children were often engaged by the time they were 5, with formal marriages sometimes happening before puberty. Actual cohabitation, to the court's credit, was sometimes delayed. Sometimes, not always. Remember, these are people who believed in divine right and bleeding out bad moods with leeches. Still, in these circles, a wedding was a chess move. Pairing 2 children together wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was political calculus. And it wasn't just Europe. In Ming China, daughters of noble families were married young to secure bureaucratic favor. In Mughal India, alliances between court families often involved adolescent brides wrapped in jewels heavier than they were. Every empire had its version of the matrimonial spreadsheet. You wander into a side room where the young groom sits with his tutor, practicing how to toast without spilling. He's 10. He misses his dog. His hair is slicked back with something that smells like apples and anxiety. The tutor reminds him that appearances are everything, then gives him a goblet he can barely lift. Historians still argue whether noble children truly understood what marriage meant. Some records suggest genuine friendships grew between these strange little spouses. Others hint at years of silence, awkward formal dinners, and competing embroidery projects. What's clear is that few had any say in the matter. Their fates were decided by ledger and land. You return to the girl's chamber. Her governess, who has survived 3 noble households and 1 suspicious poisoning incident, adjusts the girl's veil and whispers, "You only have to smile." The girl nods, and you can't help but notice how her eyes seem to drift. Not out of boredom, but as if she's mentally mapping every escape route from the manor. At the feast, a pig is roasted. A bard recites a 78-verse poem, and someone's wig catches fire discreetly. The girl is presented with a necklace that probably weighs as much as her spine, and the groom gives her a book of translated Latin love poems he doesn't understand. They hold hands, briefly. Their fingers twitch like startled mice. You sip from an imaginary goblet and try not to choke on the absurdity. But again, no one here thinks this is wrong. This is duty. This is the noble path. These kids are doing their part to preserve dynasties, ensure territorial integrity, and keep Aunt Gertrude from marrying into the wrong barony. There's a fringe detail you overhear from a tipsy steward. Some noble families kept backups, betrothing 2 daughters to 1 boy, just in case one of the girls fell ill or became uncooperative. You don't know whether to be outraged or impressed by the sheer logistical planning. When the time comes to say vows, the priest is wearing enough gold to light a city, and his voice drones like a bee trapped in a bottle. The couple stands still. The words are spoken. The legal alchemy is complete. 2 children now carry the burden of ancestral pride and national interest. You wonder if either has ever successfully boiled an egg. After the ceremony, the new bride retreats to her quarters while guests dance to music that sounds like someone rhythmically stepping on a bagpipe. She lies on her silk-draped bed, staring at the ceiling, memorizing its carvings. Lions, roses, a single oddly smug cherub. She feels less married than molted, like she shed a version of herself she didn't know she was finished being. And just like that, you're there beside her, silent and unseen. You want to tell her it's all going to be fine, but it probably won't be. Not entirely. Still, she's stronger than she looks. She'll find ways to carve out freedom in the margins. And she's got time. Maybe more than most. As the court bustles on, distracted by wine gossip and geopolitics, The girl slips out of her bed and into a quieter corner of the manor. There's a window with a ledge, and she sits there, watching the stars, humming a song no one else knows. You sit with her, quiet, still, waiting. The next room you wander into is far quieter than the manor halls. No music, no laughter, just the low murmur of Latin phrases and the rustle of parchment. Welcome to the church's chambers, where a great deal of whispering goes on about bodies, souls, and how exactly to define consent when your congregation starts marrying children. You pull your cloak tighter as you ease into the shadows of a stone chapel. A priest is preparing a sermon while arguing with himself under his breath. He's not alone. He has an audience of scrolls, books, and theological contradictions. His dilemma today? Determining if a 12-year-old has the moral and spiritual maturity to say I do before she knows how to write her own name. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had drawn a firm-ish line: 12 for girls, 14 for boys. These were the ages of consent for marriage, derived from Roman law and fine-tuned by theologians who spent far too much time writing about other people's beds. The concept wasn't based on emotion or even reason. It was about biology. If you had reached puberty, you were eligible. Never mind if you still giggled at farts or didn't know where babies came from. You slide into the pews of history and listen as priests debate the finer points of maturity. Puberty, one monk argues, is proof of God's intention. Another insists that spiritual readiness matters more than physical development. A third just wants someone to pass the mead. Scholars still argue today about how much real authority local priests had in approving or annulling early marriages. Some likely went along reluctantly. Others saw it as divine order. Back then, marriage wasn't just a civil contract. It was a sacrament, a sacred bond before God, which made it even more confusing that the church allowed marriages to be both arranged by parents and declared valid only if the couple consented. In other words, 12-year-olds could say no, but also their yes counted legally, which sounds like a poorly designed riddle. One oddity of the medieval church was this: they often recognized clandestine marriages. If a boy and girl whispered vows to each other in the woods, without witnesses or parents, the church might still bless it, because words, once spoken, carried spiritual weight. That's adorable. Until you remember, we're talking about children who just stopped believing in dragons. You lean against a pillar and think about how many of these secret weddings were desperate attempts to escape family plans. Or maybe just the product of overexcited hormones and too much cider. Either way, it made for messy legal entanglements. Local courts were left untangling cases where a girl claimed she'd been married in secret, and her family insisted she most certainly had not. Documents flew, so did accusations. The church, meanwhile, often acted more like a sleepy uncle than a strict parent. They might counsel delay. They might suggest more prayer. But rarely did they outright forbid the union. Unless there was a prior marriage, or the bride was pregnant, or the land rights were disputed. You know, spiritual things. You follow one friar out of the room. He's delivering a message to a village an hour's walk away. His sandals are barely holding together, and he carries a small pouch of communion wafers, a flask of wine, and a headache. The message: a bishop has approved the marriage of a noble girl and boy, both barely into their teens. The union will solidify a land agreement and, hopefully, discourage a family feud involving cheese theft. Children grow fast, he mutters, God willing. Then he trips on a root and drops the wafers. In some regions, especially during the later Middle Ages, there were more efforts to delay consummation until the girl reached what was considered a more reasonable age, 15, maybe 16. But enforcement varied wildly. Sometimes it was ignored entirely. Sometimes it depended on whether the groom could be patient or if the bride's family was especially persuasive or armed. There's a fringe practice you spot in a yellowing side note from a monastery diary. In one village, girls were given blessing leaves from the local abbey to carry during marriage ceremonies. If the leaf turned brown by sunset, the priest declared the girl spiritually unready, and the wedding was postponed. Spoiler alert, the leaf always turned brown. You wonder now if the church really believed 12-year-olds could make sacred vows, or if it simply lacked the bandwidth to fight every feudal lord who wanted his daughter married by the solstice. Maybe it was both. After all, theology often bent when economics pressed hard enough. At dusk, the chapel glows golden. A group of young girls enters for evening prayer. One of them kneels beside you. She's 11 maybe, hums a hymn with haunting familiarity. You imagine someone's already whispered to her who she'll marry. Maybe she's excited. Maybe she isn't sure what it all means yet. You want to ask her what she dreams about, but you don't. This is her world, and you're only visiting. It's morning again. Early, pale, and suspiciously quiet. You find yourself inside a low, timber-framed house, one of those sturdy village homes where the hearth is always burning and there's a faint, ever-present smell of boiled onions. The fire crackles gently as women bustle about, tying knots and laces, counting coins twice, and whispering as if they're afraid the smoke might carry their words into heaven. This is women's space, and today the talk is of marriage, not the church version, not the courtly version, but the practical day-to-day kind that starts with fabric swatches and ends with a quiet sigh behind a chicken coop. An older woman, grey hair in a bun, apron crusted with flour, sits hunched over a wooden table with a quill in hand. She's writing down dowry items. 1 wool blanket, half a dozen eggs, a set of wooden spoons, slightly mismatched. She pauses every few seconds to wave away a toddler and squint at the ink blotting. You've just stepped into the world of mothers, midwives, and matchmakers. You hear the low hum of agreement as the younger women discuss the groom. He's not a drunk, not too loud, and his father isn't cursed. These are frankly excellent qualifications. They pass around a cup of thin ale and compare stories. Whose marriage was arranged by a priest, whose was arranged by a merchant, and whose just sort of happened during festival season. Someone cackles at that. You're not sure who. Here, marriage is women's business as much as men's, perhaps more. The matchmaking process depends on mothers who know how to read the subtlest signs. A girl's menstrual cycle, a boy's work ethic, the way one family's cows always look vaguely smug. These details matter. A marriage too early, too late, too poorly arranged can mean disaster. Or, more likely, hunger. Historians still debate the degree of agency medieval and early modern women held in marriage arrangements. In many cases, mothers wielded quiet but powerful influence. Fathers signed contracts, yes, but women remembered debts, grudges, and which family once tried to serve spoiled trout at a feast. You trail a young midwife named Els with a flower behind her ear. She's inspecting the bride, 12 and a half, with calloused hands and a nervous giggle. The girl has been growing steadily, and that's what matters now. In this world, development is watched like rainfall. If the signs are right, a wedding can proceed. else offers a small herbal sachet to calm the girl's stomach. Chamomile and mint. She murmurs reassurance. No one talks about love, but there is affection here. Protection even. These women want the girl to fare well. They want her to find warmth, safety, a life less hard than theirs. This is how they try. Across the room, another woman is dyeing thread for the wedding tunic. It's supposed to be red, symbol of luck, fertility, and health. But the dye is faint, watery. It comes out pinkish brown. She shrugs and mutters, "Close enough for a marriage, not a coronation." You sit by the fire, unseen, as the women talk more freely. Someone mentions that one girl ran off with a traveling musician. Didn't even wear shoes. Another recalls the baker's daughter, who refused every suitor until 30, then married the village priest. He was the only one who didn't talk about goats in every sentence. There's laughter here, warmth, but beneath it, an unspoken truth. Options are limited. If you're a girl from a poor family, marriage isn't about preference. It's about timing, alliances, and having a roof over your head next winter. One woman wraps the bride's hair with a cloth dyed with crushed berries. She whispers, "Smile when they ask." You don't have to mean it, just enough to get through the stew. There's a fringe detail from a nearby region you catch in the conversation. A tradition of baking symbolic herbs into wedding bread. Dill for patience, rosemary for memory, and rue for regret. It's meant to bless the marriage, but also subtly acknowledge what's being given up. You watch as they prepare a wedding pouch. Small tokens, dried lavender, a carved charm shaped like a cat. Superstition and sentiment blend here. Each item a small hope, a small protection. Historians still argue whether girls internalize these weddings as rites of passage or as endings. Diaries are rare, letters rarer still, but oral stories suggest both. Some girls grew into their roles and found companionship, even happiness. Others simply endured. A quiet moment settles over the room. The girl stands before the mirror, really, a polished piece of metal, and smooths her tunic. Her mother adjusts the collar, then steps back, eyes misty. She doesn't say, "I'm proud," or "I love you." She just says, "Don't forget to feed the hens before dusk." That's about as emotional as this gets. You sit with the women as they watch the bride-to-be step outside, swallowed by light and noise. They return to their seats, sip from mugs, and resume weaving. One hums. Another starts a quiet prayer for strength. Not for the wedding, for the days after. Because that's when the real work begins. You're back in the village, but it's night now. The wedding feast is over. The embers in the hearth have turned to ash, and most of the guests have stumbled home, full of stewed leeks and bad dancing. In the loft above the barn, beneath a sagging thatch roof, the newlyweds lie side by side in silence. They're not sure if they're supposed to talk. Neither one has ever shared a bed before, especially not with someone else. There's a goat snoring beneath them. You wouldn't think goats snore, but they do. Loudly. You try not to laugh. The girl fidgets with the hem of her tunic. The boy stares up at the rafters, as if waiting for divine intervention. Or maybe a raccoon to fall through and break the tension. The idea of a honeymoon in this world is flexible. No trip to a seaside inn. No flower petals on straw mattresses. The closest thing to a getaway might be sleeping in the better loft for a few nights, while the in-laws generously pretend not to hear anything. And honestly, that's probably for the best. You might be imagining awkward fumbling, whispered reassurances, and a night of high medieval drama. But chances are, it's just quiet, tense. Maybe nothing happens at all. In many peasant communities, the consummation wasn't immediate. Sometimes they waited, Sometimes they didn't. It depended on nerves, expectations, and who had to milk the cow in the morning. Still, there's an odd ceremony to it all. Some households staged a bedding ritual, carrying the couple to the loft under a blanket while everyone giggled too loudly. In some places, relatives waited outside to hear signs of success. In others, the couple was left alone with awkward blessings and herbal wine. You hope they got the wine. Historians still argue how common these rituals were across different regions and classes. Some were performative, more symbolic than scandalous. Others bordered on deeply uncomfortable. The church had mixed feelings, wanting marriage to be sacred, but also obsessed with proof of legitimacy. And unfortunately, that often meant focusing on whether the marriage had been sealed. You peer out the window to where the stars glimmer coldly above the dark fields. A few chickens mutter in their sleep. The village is quiet. The girl pulls her knees to her chest. The boy offers her the better blanket. Neither knows what's expected beyond "be married now." And in the morning, the world keeps turning. The bride helps with the bread dough, kneads it in silence while the flour dusts her sleeves. The groom hauls water and gets a mild scolding for spilling some. There's no pause for romance, no candlelit glances, just the routine of survival layered over the new shape of their lives. You sit beside the fire pit as the mother-in-law explains chores, pointing with a spoon. "This is your week for cheese. Don't oversalt it like Elsa did." The girl nods. She's barely spoken today. Her new husband stops by with a sheepish grin and 2 eggs. He places them gently in a basket. It's an apology, maybe, or an offering, or just breakfast. There's a French custom in a nearby region that you overhear from a passing traveler. Some communities gifted the bride a knife, not for protection, but for peeling roots and cutting fish. Symbolic, practical, and quietly ominous. You wonder if this girl got one, or if she'll learn to sharpen her own in time. You walk with her later to the stream where she washes linens and stares at the sky. She doesn't look sad, just thoughtful, like she's measuring this new life against the stories she's heard and finding them both too small and too large all at once. In the weeks ahead, she'll learn her husband prefers sweet porridge, that he talks in his sleep, that he's afraid of mice. She'll learn how to manage his parents, who hover like anxious cats. She'll discover where she can carve out slivers of privacy, in the goat shed, or when fetching firewood, or in the moments just before dawn when no one else is awake. Historians often overlook these tiny details in favor of law codes and age charts. But this is where the marriage really happens. Not in the church or under a banner, but in shared silences and clumsy teamwork, in early mornings and burnt stews, and in the long, slow unfolding of affection, if she's lucky. And what if she isn't? What if her new husband is cruel, or distant, or indifferent? Well, then the path becomes harder, options more limited. But even then she may still find allies. Other wives, a watchful midwife, the widow with too many cats and too much wine, who knows things. The community might close ranks around her, or it might turn a blind eye. There's no guarantee. But tonight she lies under a shared blanket, thinking of her sisters, her old bed, the taste of honeycomb, and the feeling of running barefoot in the summer dust. Her husband stirs beside her and offers a nervous whisper about fetching wild berries tomorrow. She hums in response, not quite ready to smile, but not crying either. And that, in this world, is a hopeful beginning. You wake to the sound of someone hammering a fence post, not romantically, just methodically. Welcome back to the village, where the rhythm of life is clatter, creak, and quiet resignation. The air is damp with dew, and a rooster is mid-performance. Somewhere, a child is crying because someone ate the last piece of bread. The newlyweds are officially back in the real world. But today, we're talking about something less visible, less comfortable. The idea of consent. A concept that seems obvious now, but in the medieval world, was about as slippery as a bar of soap in a bathhouse. You step into the town square, where a group of elders is gathered near a notice board. There's talk of a dispute, an accusation of marriage without proper agreement. The girl said no, apparently, but her parents said yes. And the law? Well, it sort of winks and backs away slowly. Legally, canon law required consent from both parties for a marriage to be valid. 2 yeses. Simple, right? Not quite. Because the church also accepted verba de futuro, a promise to marry, and verba de presenti, a declaration that they were married. These phrases could be whispered behind a barn or exchanged under an elm tree. And once spoken, they were binding. Now, imagine you're a 12-year-old girl. Your father has arranged a match. Your mother quietly approves. The groom arrives, bearing apples and an awkward smile. You've barely spoken to him. When the priest asks if you consent, everyone looks at you. You nod. You blink. You swallow hard. You say yes, because you don't know how to say anything else. Historians still argue whether such agreements were performative or truly legal. In some court records, girls were permitted to withdraw consent, particularly if they hadn't yet reached puberty. But in practice, family pressure carried the day. Saying no meant challenging elders, losing protection, and maybe, just maybe, being labeled difficult. And no one wants to marry a difficult girl. You slip into a local tavern now, where a magistrate is holding court beside the ale barrels. A young man has accused his wife of refusing her wifely duties. She's 13. He's barely older. The villagers whisper. The girl looks like she'd rather disappear into the fireplace. The judge nods gravely. He asks if she agreed to the marriage. She shrugs. Her parents say yes. The priest confirms the vows. Then it's done, the judge declares. Case closed. The girl is handed back to her new home like a broom someone's misplaced. You feel your stomach tighten, not from outrage, but from the quiet weight of it all. These aren't villains, just people shaped by their time, their fears, their desperate grip on survival. Still, you imagine how many quiet tears were shed into straw pillows at night. There's a curious law from early modern France you overhear in passing. If a woman later claimed she was forced into marriage, the burden of proof fell to her. Unless she could produce witnesses who heard her protest or show signs of physical coercion, her marriage stood. Which means, of course, that most cases went nowhere. And yet, here and there, you catch wind of resistance. A girl in a coastal village once ran to the local abbey and claimed sanctuary. She refused a marriage to an older merchant and demanded the protection of the nuns. They gave it. The case dragged on 4 months. The girl eventually joined the abbey herself, becoming a scribe. Her handwriting was excellent. Another tale, half legend, tells of a blacksmith's daughter who shouted no during her wedding. Loudly, repeatedly, in front of everyone. The priest halted the ceremony. The groom fled in shame. She later married a sailor who told jokes and let her wear trousers while gardening. Fringe cases, yes, but they existed, and they remind you that even in these restrictive systems, there were cracks wide enough for a voice if it was brave and lucky enough to shout through them. Back in the square, you watch a boy being gently berated by his father. He's 13, newly married, and has already misplaced the family's only goat. The father grumbles about wasting a dowry on a boy who can't count. The boy kicks a stone. He looks just as bewildered as the girl did. Because here's the other truth. Consent wasn't just vague for girls. It was blurry for boys too. Many were pushed into marriage to secure land, honor deals, or get them to settle down and stop climbing trees at inopportune moments. Their yes was assumed, expected, sometimes demanded. Just like hers. You wander back toward the fields now, where the wind hums low through the barley. A pair of sparrows flutter overhead. The world, as always, is quieter in the margins. But it's in those margins, between the rules and the expectations, that human stories unfold. Stories of hesitation, of resistance, of quiet agreement and quieter protest. You pause by a small stream and wonder how many people, children really, stood at the same bend, wondering what their lives would become now that they were married. Some hoped, some feared, some simply didn't know, and many never got to ask. The morning sun peeks through low clouds, warming the dirt paths and thatched rooftops of a small town you haven't yet visited. This one feels younger somehow. Or maybe it's just the boy standing at the edge of the square, clutching a bundle of firewood like it might run away if he loosens his grip. He's 13, maybe 14, tall for his age, but still has that awkward, soft look. Shoulders too narrow, shoes too big. And he does not want to get married. You follow him from a respectful imaginary distance as he makes his way home. His tunic is patched, his boots are muddy, and his expression has all the enthusiasm of someone headed to a particularly dull execution. He's been promised to a girl from the next village over. She's 12. They've met twice. She likes geese. He's afraid of them. That doesn't bode well. The pressure is subtle, but it's everywhere. His father calls it doing your duty. His mother reminds him that no one's ever too young to be responsible. His uncle chuckles darkly and says, "At your age, I had 2 wives and a pig cart." The boy rolls his eyes and mutters something about becoming a monk. Historians still argue how common early marriage was for boys across medieval and early modern societies. While girls' early marriage gets most of the attention, understandably, boys were often pulled into arrangements young too, especially if land, inheritance, or military alliances were involved. In some regions, like parts of medieval Spain or Mughal India, a boy's marriage at 13 wasn't just common. It was expected. A signal that he was ready to step into manhood, whether or not he could grow a beard. You walk beside the boy as he approaches the cottage. There's a buzz of activity inside. His mother stirring a pot. His little brother throwing pebbles at a chicken with alarming precision. On the table sits a new belt, handmade from stiff leather. A wedding gift, his mother says brightly. He picks it up like it might bite. His future bride's family is arriving soon. There will be a short ceremony, a few loaves of bread, and a lot of thinly veiled jokes from older men about manhood and taking responsibility. You're struck by how similar it all feels to the girls' experiences. Different roles, same sense of quiet inevitability. There's a fringe story told in this region about a boy named Thomas, who, when faced with his wedding day, climbed into a tree and refused to come down for 3 full days. His father finally bribed him out with a new knife and the promise of postponing the wedding until after the harvest. A compromise. Kind of. The boy in front of you isn't as dramatic. He just asks his father if they can wait until spring. His father doesn't even look up from repairing a hoe. We wait, we lose the dowry, he says flatly. She's ready, you're ready. The boy doesn't feel ready. He wants to learn to read, to go with the traders heading south, to spend one more summer swimming in the river and pretending to be a knight. He knows that after today, that fantasy ends. Because marriage for boys isn't just about a wife. It's about work, status, taking on a household, however modest. It's about learning to plow straight lines and not cry when your cow dies. It's about responsibility in a world that barely has time for growing up. You follow him to the edge of the riverbank where he skips stones and scowls. He isn't angry, just overwhelmed. He wonders if the girl is as nervous as he is, if she wants this, if she'll hate him, or if maybe, just maybe, they'll be friends. Historians point out that for many boys, especially in noble families, marriage came with more expectation than authority. Their lives were still dictated by fathers, uncles, and the occasional meddling grandmother. Even if they were men in name, they weren't exactly in control. The boy tosses one last stone and heads back up the path. His older brother catches him by the arm and offers him a lopsided smile. "Just be kind," he says. "It'll help. You want to write that down." As the day unfolds, the ceremony is simple. The girl is quiet. The boy tries to speak clearly. They share a meal, sit side by side, and say very little. No one expects fireworks, just cooperation, maybe even contentment over time. And what if the boy really didn't want this? What if he'd said no? Well, in some rare cases, boys fled, disappeared, ran off to cities to become apprentices, monks, or hired hands. Some succeeded. Others were dragged back, hair full of straw and explanations full of holes. The stories of boys forced into marriages they didn't understand are quieter, often overlooked. But they're there, in the margins of court records, in family letters, in the nervous glances exchanged by young grooms during wedding feasts. The boy tonight doesn't run. He stands in the doorway of his new home, holding the firewood he was supposed to drop off hours ago. His new wife smiles at him once, briefly. He smiles back, unsure what comes next. But he doesn't look afraid anymore. Just young and a little hungry. You wake up to the distant clink of metal and the groan of wagon wheels turning through packed earth. This isn't your usual sleepy village. It's a dusty trade outpost, humming with movement. Tents flap in the breeze. Bright bolts of fabric hang like banners. You're somewhere along the Silk Roads, maybe near Tabriz or Samarkand, though no one here stops long enough to pin down names. You drift toward the edge of the bazaar, where a caravan is being loaded. Camels snort. A merchant yells at a donkey that seems to speak only defiance. In the middle of it, all is a girl, 13, maybe 14, dressed in silks too fine for travel. She sits quietly on a padded crate, eyes scanning the crowd with an unsettling calm. She's been traded in marriage. Not sold, not exactly. But make no mistake, she's cargo in this caravan. Her father negotiated with a trader from a noble house far away. The groom is twice her age and 3 weeks' ride to the west. She's never seen his face. She's only seen the gift he sent, a jeweled comb and a letter she can't read. The caravan master tells her when they'll leave. At dawn. He points to a heavy chest, her dowry, sealed with lacquer and rope. Inside, fine linens, dried apricots, 3 small pouches of saffron, and an ivory pin shaped like a lion. Things you give to a bride who'll be a stranger to her own wedding. Historians still debate how widespread bride exchanges like this were, but records from Central Asia, North Africa, and even Eastern Europe speak of long-distance marital pacts. Some were political, others were purely economic. Alliances made not with maps, but with wombs. A daughter sent away could mean peace, trade, or tribute, or just one less mouth to feed. You trail the girl as she's led to the tent of a female chaperone. Older, sharp-eyed, hired to keep her safe and proper until delivery. The woman speaks briskly, instructs her on etiquette, dress, and silence. She offers a piece of honeyed bread and a short nod that oddly feels like kindness. The girl eats slowly, says nothing. You pass a row of matchmakers huddled over scrolls. These aren't village women sipping stew. They're professionals. In places like medieval Baghdad, they kept books detailing eligible matches, ages, family lineage, physical traits, even temperament. Matchmaking was a formal job, a profitable one. Some did it with tact, others less so. A hushed voice behind you shares a fringe account. In 15th century Timbuktu, a girl was sent across the Sahara to marry into a scholarly family, with letters of poetry tucked into her luggage as proof of her new husband's intelligence. She read them under the stars, unsure whether to laugh or cry. As you return to the present girl, let's call her Layla, just for a moment, she's trying on new shoes. They don't quite fit. Her old sandals, worn and dusty, have been taken away. Too poor looking, says someone. The shoes pinch. She doesn't complain. That night the caravan sets off. Layla sits inside a curtained palanquin, watching the moon rise over endless sand. You walk beside her, dust clinging to your skin, the air full of camel breath and cinnamon-scented tobacco. The stars overhead are indifferent, the rhythm of hooves endless. Historians still argue whether girls sent away like this understood the significance of their journey. Were they afraid? Were they resigned? Letters from a few educated women suggest a range of emotions: sorrow, pride, confusion. A few even reported excitement, but mostly there was silence. We can only guess. On the 7th day, the caravan reaches a walled town. Layla is bathed, oiled, and wrapped in a cloak so stiff with embroidery she can barely breathe. Her groom waits in a garden filled with lemon trees. He's handsome, older, with kind eyes and uncertain hands. They speak through a translator. She says she's tired. He says he understands. You watch them sit side by side beneath a fig tree, not touching, just looking out across the courtyard where servants lay out cushions and candied nuts. Later, there will be a celebration. Musicians, guests, a formal announcement of union. For now, it is quiet. She doesn't smile, but she does ask for water, and that is something. You linger in the corner, fading with the afternoon light. In this world, brides cross borders like trade goods, sealed in contracts and softened with ceremony. Their names change, their homes vanish behind them, but their stories, if you listen closely enough, still speak through the dust. You wake on a cool stone bench in what appears to be a university courtyard, though no one here calls it that. It's the 1400s, somewhere in the shadowy overlap between late medieval and early modern Europe. And the air buzzes with debate, not birdsong. Around you, men in robes argue about philosophy, the nature of the soul, and tonight's feature presentation, the appropriate age for marriage. Yes, again, you trail one of them, a bearded scholar with ink-stained fingers and a scroll tucked under his arm. He's muttering Latin under his breath and quoting Aristotle with the kind of fervor usually reserved for brawls. Today, he's preparing to defend a thesis titled De Aetat Nuptiali, on the age of marriage. He believes 12 is far too young. His rival, however, disagrees. Across the courtyard, another scholar polishes his spectacles and insists that a girl who can spin wool and carry water can surely manage a household. Puberty, he proclaims, is nature's green light. You want to throw something at him. You don't. Historians still argue over what these age debates really meant. Were they sincere, intellectual posturing, or an attempt to shape policy? The truth is, both. These scholars were grappling with changes in economics, medicine, and moral philosophy. They were trying to define mature enough in a world where survival often trumped theory. You slip into a nearby lecture hall where a room full of fidgeting boys listens as a teacher explains the church's stance. Girls can marry at 12, boys at 14, but consummation should be delayed until the body is ready. A helpful student raises his hand and asks how one knows when the body is ready. The teacher, flustered, pretends not to hear. Out in the streets, real life trudges on. You pass a baker's daughter, sweeping steps. She's 15, unmarried, which has begun to raise eyebrows. Her parents worry she's aging out. There's a boy she likes, a mason's apprentice with a terrible haircut and a fondness for goats. But he's too poor to offer a proper dowry, so they're considering an older widower. 35, owns a barn, has most of his teeth. The girl scowls at her broom like it insulted her, then mutters, "I'd rather join the convent." You believe her, and here's where things get complicated. By this time, new laws and ideas are emerging. In some cities, local councils raise the age of marriage. Others enforce stricter parental consent rules. In Florence, for instance, new ordinances try to prevent girls under 15 from being married without a dowry of a certain value. In Prague, scholars recommend 17 as the ideal age for women. But again, these are recommendations, not rules. You overhear a fringe conversation between two traders in a tavern. One swears that in his village, girls must prove they can bake a perfect rye loaf and carry a jug of wine without spilling a drop before they can wed. A tradition, he says, not a law. The other man laughs. That's just your wife's way of delaying your niece's wedding. But even with all the laws and logic, the practice remains uneven. In poor communities, the calculus is simple. Marry early, survive longer. In noble ones, it's strategic. Marry young, produce heirs. In cities, it's flexible. If you can afford to wait, you do. You walk through a market square where a teenage boy is measuring grain. He's already married. His wife is 14 and expecting their first child. They barely speak. "We just do what we must," he says, like he's reading from a script someone handed him at birth. Historians debate whether these age thresholds were actually enforced. Church courts often turned a blind eye. Civil courts were inconsistent. Families bent the rules, bribed officials, or simply lied about their children's ages. Birth records weren't exactly airtight in a time when no one owned a calendar. And in the midst of it all, girls and boys caught in the blurry space between child and adult, trying to understand what was expected of them and whether they had any say in it. Back at the university, the two scholars are still arguing. One insists that economic readiness should determine marriage age. The other believes it should be moral development. A third, seated nearby, simply sighs and says, "What about whether they want to marry?" They all fall quiet for a moment. Then someone coughs, and the debate resumes. You slip away, past the lecture halls and cobbled alleys, into a garden where two teenagers sit side by side. They aren't married yet, but their families are negotiating. The girl traces shapes in the dirt with a stick. The boy tosses pebbles into a pond. Neither says much, and yet, in the silence between them, you hear the thing no scholar ever quite defines. The quiet ache of futures being shaped by someone else's logic. It's dusk again. The sky's dipped itself in ochre and bruised blue. and you find yourself stumbling into a field-turned festival just outside a village that smells strongly of stewed parsnips and spilt ale. You've arrived at a wedding feast, not a royal affair, not some political union, just a local celebration with crusty bread, clumsy dancing, and enough rhubarb ale to loosen even the most disapproving uncle. The bride is young, of course, 12, maybe 13. She wears a wreath of meadow flowers, slightly askew, and a hand-sewn tunic passed down from her cousin who married a cooper last year. The groom is only a few years older and already looks like he regrets wearing a collar that tight. Together, they make the world's most awkward power couple. There's no orchestra here, only 2 flutists and a drum that's been repaired more often than the village fence. But the music does its job. Invites people to shuffle in vaguely rhythmic patterns while holding tankards dangerously close to each other's faces. Wedding traditions vary wildly depending on the region. But one thing is universal: food. At this celebration, there's a pride of boiled vegetables, salted pork, and something that might have once been a pie. A round of cheese is passed like a sacred relic. Guests offer blessings by way of pickled onions and unsolicited advice. Someone toasts to fertility. Someone else immediately spills their drink. You sit beside a group of aunts debating the bride's dowry. It wasn't large, just a goat and a spindle, but she's a hard worker. They nod approvingly. Someone whispers that the groom's sister once courted a monk, and now her bread won't rise. Suspicion or yeast, you'll never know. At the head of the table, the couple picks at their meal. The bride pushes her beans around her plate. The groom tries to smile. They're seated next to the ale barrel, which is both symbolic and inconvenient. Every time someone refills their mug, they offer advice. "Keep her warm," says one. "Don't wake him before sunrise," says another. "Never argue near geese," warns a third. The couple nods, confused but polite. Historians still debate how meaningful these feasts were to the newlyweds themselves. Were they celebratory, performative, mildly terrifying? Likely a bit of all three. In some areas, the feast was more important than the vows. After all, anyone could say "I do," but only a real match could host a supper without causing 3 rivalries and a duel. You watch as a cousin of the groom performs a clumsy dance meant to bless the household. It involves stomping, clapping, and almost falling into the soup cauldron. It's not clear if this is traditional or just his thing. Everyone claps anyway. Across the fire, a midwife refills her mug and talks about her role in post-wedding customs. "I'll check on her tomorrow," she says of the bride. "Make sure everything's, settled." She raises an eyebrow, downs her drink, and returns to gnawing on a hunk of bread. In some places, this post-wedding inspection was literal. A cloth, a testimony, or even a signed statement from an elder. In others, it was symbolic. A morning visit, a nod, a basket of breakfast bread left at the door. You hope, in this case, it's just the basket. There's a fringe tradition you catch whispered between 2 old women. In one mountain village, newlyweds were expected to name a household goose together as a sign of cooperation. If they couldn't agree, the marriage was at risk. You're unsure if this is folklore or genuine. Either way, the goose was reportedly named Egbert more often than not. Back at the feast, a group of children steals the leftover stew and begins playing wedding behind a tree. One girl declares herself queen of the marriage and demands tribute. Another pretends to faint from joy. A boy tries to kiss the goat. The goat is not having it. The bride finally laughs, quietly, but it's there. The groom relaxes a little. They share a hunk of bread. It's not romantic, But it's something. You sit a while longer, listening to the rhythms of village joy, off-key singing, the snap of twigs under dancing feet, the crackle of fire, and the steady heartbeat of tradition. Not grand, not elegant, but real. Historians might miss these details, focused as they are on laws and records. But this is the heart of it. 2 children, 2 families, a long table, and a vague hope that the stew holds out. As the night deepens, one of the aunts hands the bride a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside, rosemary, dried lavender, and a tiny carved spoon. For luck, she says, and for flavor. And that, you think, is as close to a blessing as anyone gets. The wedding's long over now. The flowers have wilted. The stew pot is empty, save for a single lonely parsnip. And the fire pit is just embers and half-burnt logs. You're still in the same village, but the laughter's gone. The air feels colder, less like celebration, more like calculation. This is where sentiment ends and survival begins. You follow the bride's father out to the fields. He walks slowly, shoulders stooped, carrying a hoe that's seen too many winters. He stops at the edge of his plot and stares out at soil that won't yield. He knows. You can see it in the way he shifts his weight, looks at the sky, chews on the inside of his cheek. A bad harvest is coming. Maybe the barley was poor. Maybe the river changed course. Maybe the rains came too hard or not at all. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. Less food, more mouths. So when he married off his 12-year-old daughter last week, he wasn't being cruel. He was trying to keep everyone fed. This is what historians politely call an economic motivator. In less polite terms, a quiet panic, famine, disease, war. All of these were regular guests in peasant life, always hovering just out of sight. And when they came knocking, families had to act fast. One less dependent, one more alliance, one more chance at getting through the winter. You sit with the mother now, in a smoky kitchen, where onions are being stretched into soup. She speaks softly, counting beans as she talks. We had to. Her dowry brought flour and 3 hens. It's more than we had last week. She doesn't meet your gaze, doesn't need to. You already know. Historians still argue how often these marriages were acts of desperation versus standard practice. The records blur together, sometimes written as strategic, sometimes as timely. But between the lines, you can hear it. Hunger breathing down people's necks. And it wasn't just food. Sometimes it was taxes, or a new landlord demanding rent in coin instead of grain. Sometimes it was fear of war, or disease creeping across the countryside like a slow, invisible fog. In those moments, marriage wasn't about ceremony. It was about survival math. One fringe example, pulled from the coastal records of 14th century Brittany, tells of a father who offered his daughter in marriage to a local fisherman in exchange for a boatload of salted herring. The daughter wept. The fisherman shrugged. The wedding took place during low tide, between 2 barrels of cod. You wander into the village square where gossip buzzes like flies. A new tax has been announced, more grain to the local lord, plus labor for the roads. People murmur about which families will have to arrange something soon. The older children glance toward their younger siblings with uneasy eyes. You sit beside a young boy, maybe 10, watching the baker's cart with open hunger. "My sister's getting married," he says without turning his head. "Mama says it so we can keep the goat." His tone is flat, matter-of-fact, like it's just another trade. Sister for goat, hearth for firewood. He tosses a rock at a bird and misses. Later, you walk past the bride again. Our 12-year-old girl. She's now chopping wood with a determined rhythm. her cheeks flushed with cold. Her new home isn't cruel, but it is demanding. Her mother-in-law barks orders. Her husband leaves at dawn to work the fields. She's expected to clean, cook, care for the goats, and, in due time, bear children. There's no time to adjust, no grace period. She's already behind on her tasks. A neighbor stops by and drops off some leeks. They say it'll be a hard winter, she mutters, tugging her shawl tighter. Good thing you married in time. She says it like congratulations, or maybe condolence. You can't quite tell. That night, as wind scrapes the roof and cold slips through the shutters, you watch the girl wrap herself in 3 layers of worn wool and try to sleep. She stares at the ceiling, unmoving. The silence around her is thick, broken only by the occasional grunt of the goat and the creak of old timber. You want to whisper something. But what? You look at her father, still awake, staring into the embers of his hearth, wondering if he made the right call, wondering if next year will be better, wondering if there will be a next year. And you understand now that these choices, however awful, weren't made in isolation. They were made with cold hands and cold logic when the only question was, who gets to eat? You open your eyes to a soft rustling sound and the pale light of early dawn filtering through trees. You're not in a village or manor this time, but at the edge of a forest path, watching a girl run. She's barefoot, carrying a bundle wrapped in linen, and moving with that mix of fear and resolve that tells you this isn't a morning stroll. It's a quiet rebellion. She's just 12, or maybe 13. Her wedding was supposed to happen yesterday, but instead of reciting vows in front of a smiling priest, she climbed out of a window after dark and vanished into the woods. Her name might be Annika, or Hafsa, or Rosalie. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she said no, quietly, clearly, and then with her feet. You follow her as she walks. Her dress is torn. Her bundle is light. Just bread, a knife, and a scarf from her sister. She doesn't know where she's going, but she knows where she won't return. Not to the man old enough to be her father. Not to the mother who said, "It's just how things are." Not to a future shaped by everyone, but her. Historians know these stories mostly through the gaps. Records of missing girls, legal cases brought by furious fathers, letters sent by exasperated priests. Every now and then, a tale of a runaway bride slips through. Sometimes they were caught. Sometimes they were married off anyway. But sometimes, just sometimes, they found another path. Like the girl you now see, crouching behind a cart near the monastery wall, hoping the monks will take her in. Some did. Some turned girls away. But a few, especially in more remote areas, offered sanctuary. A convent meant safety, education, and autonomy. It wasn't freedom in the modern sense, but it was a way out, a way sideways. A friar spots her, raises an eyebrow, and silently leads her through the gate. No questions, just a nod. She exhales for the first time in hours. Now shift scenes, far to the south. You're on a dusty road watching a boy disappear into the hills. He's supposed to be married by now, but he's had enough of his father's talk about duty and lineage. He wants to carve wood, not raise pigs. He joins a band of traveling merchants offering to work for food. They take him on, amused by his enthusiasm and his wildly inaccurate sense of direction. He never returns home, becomes a craftsman in a seaside town, marries at 25, by choice. Historians still debate how often these refusals occurred and how often they succeeded. Most children didn't run. Most didn't have the means or the courage. But those who did, they rippled through the records like soft echoes, barely there, but unmistakable. In one fragment from a German abbey archive, there's mention of a girl who refused 3 suitors and took up the needle instead. No further explanation, but you can picture her, stitching quietly, head held high, no husband in sight. There's even a fringe tradition in parts of rural Scandinavia where girls could declare their refusal of marriage by standing barefoot in church and publicly tearing a ribbon in half. It was seen as both theatrical and binding. Rare, yes, but real. Imagine the silence that followed such a gesture. Back in the village, not everyone agrees with early marriage either. You visit a small home where a widow tends to her herb garden. She's in her 50s, sharp-eyed and unbothered by gossip. She tells stories of how she refused marriage at 13, was labeled strange, and never regretted it. Better strange than silent, she mutters, tying sprigs of thyme with expert fingers. You see change here, not as thunder, but as trickle. One girl runs, one boy disappears. One aunt whispers, "Let's wait one more year." One monk frowns at a wedding contract and says, "She's too young." Tiny moments of friction, tiny acts of rebellion. Even some priests begin to push back. You walk through a small stone chapel where a younger cleric carefully edits a marriage certificate. He's delaying it, changing the birth date slightly. He says nothing, just winks. In towns, you hear new voices. Young women who return to their families after unhappy marriages. Boys who refuse second engagements. Stories of annulments quietly granted. Sometimes with the help of sympathetic elders or bribes paid in honey and patience. And then, your favorite part, children quietly plotting in corners. A pair of friends whispering behind a bakery, making pacts never to marry, without each other's approval. A 12-year-old girl writing down the names of all the plants that can make people sleep very deeply. Just in case. Resistance, you realize, doesn't always look like flames or swords. Sometimes it's a skipped ceremony, a delay, a question asked twice instead of once. Sometimes it's just a girl in the woods, still running. You're back in a candlelit room now. This one smells like ink and old dust. Exactly the scent of bureaucracy doing its best to catch up with human behavior. Shelves sag under the weight of parchment scrolls and leather-bound ledgers. Somewhere in this dim legal archive, change is trying to happen. Slowly, reluctantly, one clause at a time. It's the 1600s, and the age of consent is under revision. Sort of. A man in a plain robe scribbles notes with a quill that's seen better days. He's a clerk, tasked with copying out the newly proposed regional statutes. These laws raise the legal marriage age. Or rather, they raise the official age. 12 becomes 13. 13 becomes 15. The ink dries with great promise. But out in the villages, no one really notices. You wander through the documents and find that many places did begin to question child marriage more openly. Enlightenment thinkers, physicians, and moralists all started voicing concern. Not because they had suddenly discovered empathy, necessarily, but because they worried about population growth, health, and social order. A sick pregnant teenager was not great for the workforce, and so reform trickled in. In parts of Europe and the Middle East, marriage contracts now had to be witnessed more formally. In some cities, parental consent became mandatory. In others, a minimum economic threshold had to be met. And yet, these were often policies without teeth. Without consistent enforcement, they made about as much impact as whispering during a thunderstorm. Historians still argue over how effective these new laws really were. Some say they were largely symbolic, meant to appease growing moral pressure from reformers and clergy. Others point to court records, cases where underage marriages were annulled, priests fined, and families reprimanded. The truth? It varied wildly, region to region, case to case. You sit in on a town council meeting where two elders debate whether the miller's daughter should be allowed to marry at 13. She's mature, says one. She owns a goat. She can't spell her name, counters the other. The meeting ends with a shrug and a vote in favor of the goat argument. Even as laws shifted on paper, old habits remained resilient. In rural areas, local customs still trumped legislation. If a family decided it was time, the wedding went ahead. And if anyone questioned it, they were told, "This is how we've always done it." But not everyone was content to let things slide. You pass a small chapel where a young priest refuses to perform a wedding. The bride is too young, he says, and he doesn't care what the parents think. He's reprimanded, quietly of course, but his decision ripples through the village. The next family waits a year. Just one, but still. A fringe law in 17th century Denmark required couples to present themselves for maturity inspection before marriage if either was under 16. That involved a physician, a church official, and in some cases, a midwife. No one liked the process. Some skipped it. Others bribed their way through. But the law existed, and it frightened just enough people to cause delays. Back in the archive, a different scribe sighs heavily and crosses out a line. He's copying a ruling from the Holy Roman Empire, one that says girls must be at least 15 and boys at least 18 to marry without parental approval. It sounds modern, progressive even, but it has so many loopholes you could drive a goat car through it. As the candle burns lower, you overhear a conversation between two mothers outside the records room. One says her daughter is almost 14, but still plays with dolls. The other nods. Mine is 15 and plays with knives. I think that balances out. They laugh, then fall quiet, and decide together to wait another season. Progress, you realize, doesn't gallop. It limps. It stops to tie its shoe. It takes wrong turns, forgets its paperwork, and sometimes loses the map entirely. But it keeps moving, just barely, because someone keeps asking, "Are we sure this is okay?" You return to the village, where a girl is learning to write her name in the dirt. Her teacher, a wandering friar, tells her she can spell anything she wants, except the word wife, until she chooses to. You nod in approval, then pass a group of boys being lectured on responsibility by a father who still hasn't learned to patch his own boots. The boys look unimpressed. You can feel it now, something shifting. A new generation growing up just slightly more skeptical, slightly more curious, slightly more willing to ask the unaskable. Why so young? Why so fast? Why not wait? The road is paved now. Not entirely. There are still patches of dirt and the occasional horse dropping. But the air has a different scent. A little less smoke. A little more coal. You've arrived in the 19th century. The industrial era, where factories hum, railways hiss, and marriage still happens far too early, just with better documentation. You're in a small British town, soot on the windowsills, and the smell of bread mixing uneasily with chimney smoke. You pass a factory gate, where girls no older than 13 file in for a 10-hour shift. Cotton dust sticks to their sleeves. Their eyes are dull. Most are already married or about to be. You follow one, let's call her Elsie, home. She walks past rows of cramped brick houses, through a wooden door into a kitchen no bigger than a broom closet. Her husband waits inside, already asleep in a chair. He's 16, works the coal carts. They married last year. Her mother thought it would keep her safe. From what? No one really says. By this time, laws are changing faster. reformers are louder. Child labor is under scrutiny, and child marriage comes next. Religious groups and women's rights advocates begin demanding age restrictions with actual enforcement. Some countries raise the minimum marriage age to 16, others 18. But loopholes remain, especially with parental consent. Historians still debate how successful these reforms were. Age of consent laws improved on paper, but stumbled in practice. Poor families, especially in industrial cities, continue to marry off daughters early as a way to consolidate households and share rent. One less room to heat, one less mouth to feed independently. Everything was economics. You heard a fringe case whispered at a sewing circle. A girl of 11 married off to her uncle's business partner after her father's death. The man was 25, had a steady job, and promised to provide. When questioned, he said, "She needed someone. I needed company." The law said nothing. You sit with Elsie at the wash basin as she scrubs her apron. She talks about a neighbor who ran off with a clerk from the newspaper office. They got married in Wales, she says, no questions asked. Her voice isn't bitter, just tired. She wonders if she'll be lucky enough to love her husband eventually. She doesn't dislike him, but they've never really talked beyond chores and bills. In the United States, you peek into courtrooms where young girls fight for annulments. Some win, some don't. In one well-known case, a 13-year-old bride petitions to be freed from a 30-year-old husband. The judge rules in her favor, only because the man had lied about his age, not because she was a child. In rural India, laws are being drafted to raise the marriage age for girls to 12, then to 15. Reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy and later Mahatma Gandhi advocate against child marriage, citing education and health. But traditionalists push back, claiming such changes go against family structure, honor, and religion. The fight continues. You walk through a schoolhouse in France where a teacher gently scolds a student. 12, engaged to a family friend. You're good at arithmetic, the teacher says. You could be a clerk. The girl shrugs. I'll be a wife first. She isn't sad. She's simply already imagined it too long to resist. You visit Africa, where colonial authorities impose European marriage laws onto deeply varied cultural traditions, some of which already had protections for girls, others that did not. The colonial law often makes things worse, creating contradictions that allow exploitation to flourish unchecked. And yet, there is movement. Girls begin writing. Diaries, letters, essays, voices emerge. You read one from a girl in Boston, 1882. They say I'm a woman now, she writes, but I still play with string and shells. I miss being small. In London, a parliamentarian argues passionately for setting 16 as the absolute minimum age of marriage. He's mocked by some colleagues, but the vote passes. Barely. It's a beginning. You ride a train beside a social worker taking notes. She's part of a new movement, tracking underage brides, interviewing families, proposing alternatives, education, apprenticeships, scholarships, anything to delay the inevitable. Her eyes are heavy, but her spine is steel. And finally, you walk through a modern hallway. Bright, clean, lined with lockers. A girl in sneakers passes by, her backpack covered in pins. She's 12. She's talking about a book she read, not a man she's supposed to marry. And though the world still hasn't let go of old habits entirely, there's a light in her steps that wasn't always there. You smile, just a little.